Okay, so we've seen so far that a number of languages that allow voicing contrasts in the general case before a vowel or before a sonorant consonant, or possibly in other contexts, uh, neutralize those contrasts in word final context when those consonants are not before a vowel or a sonorant consonant. So we saw this in Thai or German. We're going to take a look at a couple more contexts here. And in particular, we're going to be interested in what kinds of voicing contrasts are or not allowed before different kinds of consonants. So for these next sets of English and Kasi data, we're going to be focused on contexts that are before a non-sonorant consonant and before a sonorant consonant in particular. And so when you're doing things this way, it's often easier to separate these kinds of when you're tracking which segments appear where. If you're focused on a particular context, it's sometimes easier to separate those by context rather than by the features and take a look at what kinds of segments appear in each context. So for these ones, we're going to look at the contexts before a sonorant consonant. And that would actually include vowels because vowels are plus sonorant even though they're not consonants. And then we can also look at before obstruent consonants. Right? So what kinds of segments do we get here? Well, let's start with English. And these English facts are really limited basically to mostly two-syllable words where the first syllable is stressed. If you get different kinds of context in English, these facts change a little bit. But in this context, we'll see there's some pretty clear facts about licensing here. So these are going to be words with stress patterns like April, where the first syllable is stressed, the second one is unstressed. The question is, what kinds of sequences of consonants do we get in the middles here? And so if we're looking before a sonorant consonant, where this is going to be the second consonant as a sonorant, we're interested in what kinds of first consonants appear there. In this context, where it's before an obstruent, that's where the second consonant is a stop or a fricative, and the question is, what's the first consonant like in those cases? So in April, the second consonant is the sonorant R, and we find a P segment there, a voiceless bilabial stop. In this one, L in maudlin is a sonorant consonant, and so before that we find a voiced coronal stop, D. In picnic, that second consonant, N, is a sonorant, and we find a voiceless stop before it. How about over here? Captain, signal. So captain, that T sound is a non-sonorant, and we find a P there. And I will, just giving away the plot a little bit here, we're actually going to need separate columns for a voiceless obstruent and for a voiced one. So let me separate these out as well. Before T, that's a voiceless obstruent. What else do we find here? Signal. So that's before a sonorant. The N sound there is a sonorant. We have a voiced stop. Acrid. So that's a sonorant. We have another K there. We already have that one listed. What else here? Pizza. So before a voiceless sonorant S, we have a voiceless obstruent S. We have a voiceless obstruent T. Aggravate. So that's before the sonorant R. We have a voiced stop G. Taxi. So again, before a voiceless obstruent S, we have a voiceless stop K. What else do we have here? Atlas. So that's before a sonorant. We have a voiceless stop. Active. Before a voiceless sonorant, we have a voiceless stop, and we already have that listed here. Hebrew. So before the sonorant R, we have a voiced B. Oh, and I guess, okay, I did not actually include the voiced obstruent context in here, so ignore this. That was me anticipating something else in the class. So we're really just interested in voiceless obstruents and sonorants here. And what should become apparent is that in this context, we find a variety of voiced and voiceless stops. And in fact, there are some near minimal pairs for voicing in these data. So for instance, acrid and aggravate right? This is a voiceless stop and a voice stop that appear in identical contexts, following an a vowel and preceding a r sound. I forgot to use the upside down r in this transcription, but that's what it is, showing us that the voicing feature is contrastive in that context. But before a voiceless obstruent in English, we only find the voiceless series. Right? And in words with this general shape of being mostly two syllables with stress on the first, this is basically exceptionless in English. So you can have words like pizza, but there are no words in English like pizza or something like that. Taxi is good, but taxi is not really allowed. Captain, okay, but cabtin, there are no words like that in English. There are a few exceptions to this if you look in proper names, but proper names actually always have a different phonological grammar than other words in a language anyway. So we don't expect those to be subject to exactly the same ranking of phonological constraints. Basically, what we're seeing here is that English, we already saw it allows voicing contrast before a vowel and at the end of a word, not before a vowel, and it allows voicing contrast before a sonorant consonant, but not before an obstruent. So here, the contrast neutralizes, and in the context of a following voiceless obstruent, it neutralizes to voiceless. We haven't seen what happens before a voiced obstruent yet. We'll get there later in class. Right? Okay, so that's yet another wrinkle in the English pattern. So even in English, where we've treated voicing as being a full contrast or a phonemic contrast, you can see there actually is some context in which that contrast is not available, in which it's neutralized. So it's not the case that this voicing contrast, or maybe any other contrast in English, is allowed absolutely everywhere, but it's allowed in most contexts, and it neutralizes in one specific one, where the sounds in question are being followed by a voiceless obstruent sound. This is a sound where it's going to be very hard to hear voice onset time because there's no voicing to onset in the following sound. Definitely no formant structure. You would expect VOT contrast to be more difficult to perceive in this context, just as we saw in German and Thai that voicing and aspiration contrast, laryngeal contrast more generally, tend to neutralize in places where VOT will be hard to hear. Okay, what about Khasi? And this is an Austroasiatic language. What kinds of sequences of two consonants do we have in Khasi? Well, let's see here. Clear out all this English data. First word, bdi, 20. So this is before a voiced sonorant. Let me now put in this other context here. Now it becomes relevant. And there we find a voice stop b, bna to here. So that's before a sonorant consonant. We find the b there, no problem. Pden, that's before a voiced obstruent duh. We find a voiceless obstruent p. That's interesting. In fact, it looks like we have a minimal pair here for voicing. Bdi and pden, these two initial sounds, both at the beginning of a word, both preceding a duh, contrast for voicing. So looks like voicing contrast there in a context where you definitely can't get one in English. We also have pla here. So that would be before a sonorant. Oop. And it looks like we're probably going to get contrast in this context as well. Bti, so this is before a voiceless obstruent t. And here we find a voiced b sound. Bri, so we already have a b before a sonorant there. Anything else? Beteng, we already have a b in that voiceless obstruent context. Blang, we already have a b before a sonorant. Pda, we already have a p before a voiced obstruent. Pnar, we already have a p before a sonorant consonant. And here is pte pte, so this is a voiceless obstruent p before a voiceless obstruent t. And this is, we're looking just at the labial ones in this data set because I wanted to keep it relatively manageable. But for these labial stops, you can see that the voiced and voiceless versions can both appear in all of these contexts. So Khasi is a language that comes very close to having an obstruent voicing contrast in every single context. So really free phonemic contrast in Khasi. It's pretty unusual in this regard. I don't know of any other languages that work like this. That doesn't mean there aren't any. I just might not have seen descriptions of them, but it's definitely a possible pattern to have a voicing contrast that basically doesn't neutralize anywhere. Even in contexts where you do find neutralization in languages like English. Right? Here we go. What we're basically seeing when we look typologically at everything we've just done, right, is that there's a variety of languages that allow voicing contrasts, and all of the languages we've seen here, if they have voicing contrasts anywhere, they have them before vowels, for sure. So that's true in English, true in Thai, true in German, and true in Khasi. If they neutralize those contrasts anywhere, they get neutralized in places like before another obstruent, or word finally when they're, not before a vowel. So this is a robust typological generalization, and this has been studied by many linguists for many years, and it is generally the case in just about every language that's been documented. If there's a voicing contrast, if the language allows voicing contrasts anywhere, then it will generally do so before a vowel and sometimes before a sonorant consonant. Those are the two most likely contexts for voicing contrasts to be allowed. And if a language neutralizes those voicing contrasts anywhere, it's most likely to be before sonorant contexts or at the end of a word or both. So this is a robust typological generalization, and it corresponds to these facts that we've just discussed about voice onset time, where before we even went into this data, just based on the phonetics of how voicing and laryngeal contrast work in general, we thought that these contrasts should be easiest to hear when they're occurring in the context where the following sound has relatively strong voicing and formant values, namely sounds like following vowels or liquids or approximants, and that seems to be exactly what we're finding cross-linguistically here. So this is an example of a deductive chain of reasoning. We start out with general principles of how voicing and laryngeal contrasts work, and we use that to learn things about specific language patterns. Namely, we started with this idea that the following context should be important, and then when we looked at the distribution of voicing contrast in these languages, we found indeed that that following context is important in exactly the ways that we thought it would be. Namely, are you followed by a vowel or not followed by a vowel? Are you followed by a consonant that's a sonorant or a non-sonorant? These seem to matter for voicing contrasts. In the last video for this week, we're going to take this one step further in German, where we are going to be able to see not only that there are no word final voiced obstruents in German, but we're going to use some special kind of evidence to see what would happen if you did have a word final voiced obstruent in German.